We are live and streaming on all of our various platforms. Hey, everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thank you for joining us. So thrilled to have you back here for our virtual author series, which we have been doing for a little over a year now. We've done about 140 or so of these virtual events in that time. And I'm excited to say we just kind of teased it today, but July 24th will be our first in-person author event since March of 2020. We haven't said who it is yet, but it will be exciting and you'll hear more about it. So keep an eye on that. A lot of other big stuff coming. I would encourage you to check our website, magiccitybooks.com. I won't go through the full list, but certainly pertinent to tonight's discussion, we do have quite a few programs dealing with the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, including the official book launch for Scott Ellsworth's follow-up to Death in a Promised Land. We have a conversation with Don Lemon from CNN for a wonderful new book he has out on race relations, specifically how to talk to your white friends about race, and many other things. So I would encourage you to check that out. Most of it, if not all of them, are free and open to the public. And it's just, of course, one component of the myriad programs being put around the city by all different organizations. So we're thrilled to be kind of one spoke on that wheel. Really excited about tonight's event. Of course, we are called Magic City Books. And I'd like to just kind of begin by telling you a story, which is when I was in high school, and probably my junior year of high school, I picked up this book called Magic City. And I only picked it up because, superficially, I saw that it said something about Tulsa on the description. And, I'd never really read anything other than like The Outsiders that had been set in Tulsa. And, when you're a kid, if you see something about your hometown, that seems like interesting to you. And so I read this book. And to be honest with you, I thought it was like about real magic, and it kind of is. So we'll talk about that too. But, there was, I think, mention of Houdini on the description or something. So I didn't quite know what to expect. And I read this book and it kind of knocked me out. And to be totally candid and honest with you all, I had never at that point, growing up my whole life here, heard of what was then called and referenced the Tulsa Race Riot, which if you read about it at that time, that's how it was called. But the Tulsa Race Massacre, I had never heard about it in school. I even went down with my family to concerts on Greenwood. There was a wonderful jazz festival that happened down in Greenwood. I would see people like, Natalie Cole and all kinds of amazing performers in Greenwood. And it never, at least to me, was brought up. It was not referenced on the stage, that this kind of hollowed ground that we were standing on. And so I felt totally ignorant that I had not heard of that. But then the more I mentioned it to people around me in this book, they hadn't heard about it either, which was such a horrifying revelation to me. And this book stuck with me, and it's been the book, I would say, over my, the last 25 years that I probably recommended to people more than any other book. And when it came time to name our bookstore, knowing that we would be in what was historic Greenwood on Archer and Detroit Avenue, I knew that we would have to be called Magic City. And we'll talk about what that means, but it certainly was a tribute to the wonderful author that we have with us tonight. And if you don't know Jewell Parker Rhodes, Dr. Jewell Parker Rhodes, you should know that beyond Magic City, of course, that book was written 25 years ago. She has gone on to write a ton of other wonderful books, but has really become, I think, one of our leading writers for young readers. And if you haven't seen Ghost Boys or Black Brother, we'll talk a little bit about some of those books as well tonight. But could not be more thrilled and honored to have Dr. Jewell Parker Rhodes with us tonight. So we're going to talk a little bit. I hope you guys, if you haven't read Magic City, you've got to read this book. We think it was the first novel about this issue. We'll talk a little bit about that. And like I said, it was certainly the first moment that this piece of integral history about the city I love and have lived in came into my life. So we're going to be putting links for this beautiful new edition that HarperCollins has put out, Harper Perennial, really beautiful new edition. So you can get that from us. And if you have questions throughout the conversation, please drop those in and we'll get to them. But welcome, Jewell Parker Rhodes. So great to see you.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. I never knew that story. That really just inspires me and makes me feel, so I don't know, so warm in terms of a writer. I always talk about how words have power, but to think of all the links that it's had in your life, that really just flabbergasts me. I'm so proud and I'm so happy. And I didn't know we were connecting as kin all those decades. So it's really finally nice to meet you.
Yeah,
Thank
I mean,
you.
it's been such, I don't think you get to pick the books that mean things to you in your life. In some ways, it feels like they find you. I think, and I'm sure you've had that experience as well. And I actually remember, I just read a book. Have you read Alice Randall's Black Bottom Saints? This new book that she has out.
No, I haven't. Yes.
What's funny, it's a wonderful book, also, but its cover kind of reminded me of the original hardcover of Magic City, which had that kind of beautiful illustration. And anyway, that's an aside. But I'd like to kind of talk about the book has just been re-released.
Yes.
The book that you and what's funny about to me, I told that story about that moment of revelation to me where I kind of realized that the thing I was reading about actually happened, which is a strange moment. If you can imagine being a teenager reading a book about some horrific event in the place that you live and thinking for a moment that it was this kind of speculative fiction, and then realizing, no, this actually happened. And it was actually in some ways far worse because it was real and not just on the page. That was a strange moment. But when you set out to write this book, you're not from Tulsa. This was not something that was like part of your life growing up. Can you talk about when this incident first became on your radar?
I was actually reading the Sunday paper, and they had in the Parade magazine a column by the Wallaces that would have like weird historical events. And literally I saw the newspaper, the clipping that said, the only US city bombed from the air. And it showed a picture of Tulsa devastated and had like 3 paragraphs talking about, Dick Rowland and Sarah Page, the Black man and the white woman. There was a scream, and then the lynching began, and the bombing was given permission to, and the community was interned. And one of the things that I have always done when I was sort of like beginning as a writer, I was searching for untold stories, particularly about my African American cultural tradition. So it's like, what? I hadn't heard, what are you talking about? And in fact, I was finishing my first novel, Voodoo Dreams. So it took me a while to gather research. And I actually remember when I was finally done with Voodoo Dreams, I came to Tulsa and I got the privilege of meeting Scott Ellsworth, who, like me, was much younger. And his Death in a Promised Land, his thesis was very important to me. And I remember the graciousness of him in introducing me to the Tulsa. But what I remembered most from what Scott said these decades since is that we're still looking for the mass graves. And it still astonishes me that it's been 100 years. And though there's been perhaps some progress, nobody's been held accountable, and the mass graves haven't been found.
There's a cemetery on the outskirts of downtown called Oak Lawn Cemetery, which is where they're actually doing that excavation right now. And a couple of days ago, they provided an update, which I would encourage people to look for this story about some DNA, and that they're starting to believe more and more that is the case. Now, who knows, where that will lead. And, certainly the talk of the next steps hasn't been had yet, but 25 years later, I guess the momentum in some ways of the centennial is helping some of that. But in 1995, 96, when you're writing this book, there was really no internet, right? There is, you're having to kind of use, you're having to use books and kind of human resources. But the one thing you did have, beyond Scott Ellsworth, who is, kind of in some ways the kind of go-to person, especially at that time, having written that book, Death in a Promised Land, there were people still around, descendants and people who had lived through that. The fact that 25 years ago, did you get a chance to meet anyone here?
I did meet a few, but I do actually make it a point not to tell, I worry about telling other people's stories per se, because that's not my story to tell, that I want to honor that their own sensibilities. So I had known about several people and known certainly about the Franklins and John Hope Franklin, but for the most part, my characters are inspired by my imagination. So my job as a fiction writer is to find the lies that tell the emotional truth about, or what I think is the emotional truth about what happened. And then it gets constructed in a way that I make my themes and my take on this history. So it's very different from nonfiction. And when people ask me, Jewell, why then bother to write fiction? I think that fiction makes a story stick to your bones and your hearts even more. That there are tons of nonfiction books, but if I get you to feel what it might have been to be a young Black man who literally, whoa, this white woman has screamed and I'm on the run, you know, or the white woman at a time when she too was being oppressed because she was like not fitting the sexist script of what she should do and say as a white woman, that'll give you an entry point that will make you have the empathy and then inspire you to do your own searching, your own researching, and for the people who live through it, their own storytelling, which of course they have. And there are lots more books now where I can hear those voices. But no, I do something that's a little bit different.
Well, you know, that's exactly what happened to me. You know, as I said, you know, reading that book and having it be kind of the first crumb on a trail, you know, to learn more, because I think that's what novels do best. And you just kind of said this was, you know, nonfiction tells you what happened.
Yes.
Fiction tells you what it felt like when
Yes.
it happened, right? And that's two very different things.
Yes, yes. And look at you. So you are a prime example that it's almost as though in that emotional connection that you made transformed your intellectual life, your spiritual life, your probably career choices, that it really gave you, you know, a path to follow that you said, I'm down, including having your store in the Greenwood district.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's true. It's definitely a pivot point that you kind of didn't even know I was following probably when I was, you know, in my 20s. But I kind of came back, you kind of boomerang back
Yes,
to where you
yes.
start. When you had the opportunity to kind of do this reissue of the book, you provided a new afterword for the book. And obviously a lot has transpired in that time. And the general awareness of the event has exponentially grown.
Yes.
But when it came out, did you run into people who were like me that didn't understand that this was a real event? Was that a common occurrence from readers?
Absolutely. And in fact, I also got a lot of hate mail from people around the country, but a lot from Oklahoma, telling me that I was just a flat out liar. And I found out a book reviewer, my friend Betty Webb in Arizona, she waited a year to tell me that she had gotten hate mail because she had written a book review about a fiction book about Deep Greenwood. And actually, HarperCollins at the time had planned a 10-city book tour. But they were bought out by Robert Murdoch. My editor left. And next thing I knew, I was on a plane and the book was remaindered. They tried to revive it again for the paperback edition in terms of having more advertising. But ironically, I was in Oklahoma City when Timothy McVeigh was being sentenced for his attack on the federal building. So quickly, all the plans that we had had for Oklahoma and elsewhere just sort of dissipated. But I find now a great contrast that this story has taken so long to be known, and it gets really into who controls the narrative, who tells cultural stories, and the way that the master narrative has suppressed this particular story of the race massacre. But with Timothy McVeigh and now with the rioters at the Capitol on January 6th, I'm struck by how our government has gone after terrorists who have attacked white institutional structures. But no one, as far as I know, has gone after the terrorists in 100 years who attack this thriving, wondrous Black community.
Yeah. My day job is I work at a beautiful museum here in town called Philbrook Museum of Art, and we have an exhibition up right now, and it has a very famous piece in the show by the wonderful artist Faith Ringgold. And yeah, talk about an icon. But she has a piece called The United States of Attica, and it's a huge map of the United States. And on it, this is the 1972, I believe. She attempted at that time to chronicle every incident of racial mass violence in America. Oh, and then since then, as it has traveled around, the viewers are invited to fill in things that maybe they weren't known or things that happened since.
Oh my God.
So when you see the map, of course, the Tulsa Race Massacre is certainly on that, but it's only one of, and that's the ones we know of. Yeah.
Yes,
and so talk about where you grew up, what did you have anything in your childhood that kind of was something like that you knew about in other areas of the country that happened that were similar to this? Of course we know about like Rosewood and some of the kind of more famous spaces. But.
I grew up bi-coastal, Pittsburgh in California. My Pittsburgh years were when my mother had left the family and my grandmother raised me. So I was truly living in a segregated community, impoverished, poor educational structures. And I actually didn't see my first white person until I was in kindergarten and grandma took me downtown. Wow. But one thing that sort of has stuck with me, and I write about this in Ghost Boy, was the murder of Emmett Till. And I remember seeing his casket. I remember the memorials. I remember all the news every anniversary of his death. And in those days, they didn't believe that you should hide brutality or racism from children. So I also still have images in my head of lynchings. Now, how I got to California, we'll leave that for another day. But throughout my entire childhood, though, even though I was experiencing the culture of my grandmother telling me, African-American folklore and stories and experiencing racism and trauma in a way that I didn't fully understand, all the books that I was given by teachers and librarians were books written by white authors about white characters. My family couldn't afford books. And so I'm just thinking, oh, these are the great stories, and the humanity of them enriched my life and gave me hope. But it wasn't until I was a junior in college that I discovered that Black women wrote books. And I switched my major from theater to English like the very next day. And from that moment, I was trying to answer the question regarding African-American cultural stories. How come I didn't know? And so the parade article, I just collected it and carried it across the country while I was writing about a voodoo queen. How come I didn't know about Marie Laveau? And actually, in terms of writing Magic City, when I proposed it to my then editor, they didn't want the book. They wanted another Voodoo Dreams. And so I actually remember crying at Christmas and saying, no, but I have to tell the story because I have to know, how did this happen? What does this mean, Yeah. And I actually then went to HarperCollins, but all my books are about reclaiming narratives that have been lost or mistold, are just buried out of, conscious, willful, racism. So it was a natural for me in terms of what my career to be was to become, but in terms of thinking about going from a voodoo queen to a second novel about Tulsa, my God, I can't believe I was dumb and stupid. I mean, instead of writing short stories, I immediately went to the novel, and wrote about New Orleans, which I wasn't from New Orleans. And then this idea that I had this passion, I had to know about Tulsa. Mm-hmm. So I'm driven by this passion, and I just try to do my best to work my butt off and honor the spirit of how this gets incorporated into understanding Black resilience, Black resistance, Black entrepreneurship, and so much more. And that's what satisfies me. So really and truly, I want everyone to read my stories, but you're a prime example. I'll settle for one.
Well, I think, had this been, for example, I would never have read probably Scott Ellsworth's book when I was 17 or 18. I was interested in stories. The narrative has the power to kind of pull you in, and of course, as I mentioned, when I first saw this book, just being totally candid, I thought it was like about like magicians and stuff, but there is that component, right? So maybe for people who haven't read the book, talk about Joe Samuels, introduce us to Joe Samuels.
Oh, and actually I worked 6 months to get Joe Samuels' book. This was my first time writing a male character. And my husband used to say to me, because he'd read everything, men don't talk that way. And I gotta tell you, so many pillows that I threw at his head and we get so mad and storm out of the room. But just let me read this first paragraph. Joe Samuels had decided to quit dreaming, decided to stop dreaming of leaving Tulsa, of discovering new horizons streamed with magic. Yet here he was, lying by the tracks, his head to the ground, listening to the rumblings of the 945 preparing to leave, trailing Pullman cars and flat cars loaded with cotton and crude. Weary, disoriented, Joe needed sleep. He wanted to ride the rails to the Rockies. He wanted to ride the rails over the Rockies to the Pacific in a sleeper car, cozy, dreamless in an upper bunk. He didn't want to dream of dying. 3 nights in a row, he'd had the same dream, a dream that he sensed was something more than a dream, a haunting, a premonition, an evil worked by the devil. And of course, he's dreaming as prophecy about the burning of deep Greenwood. But right there, you get that sensibility that my grandmother raised me in a world of spirits. She came up from Georgia with folklore and hoodoo, and that dreams meant something, signs meant something. And so it automatically opens up this door that Joe knows something's going to happen. But it also fit in with my idea that when I was starting the novel, I didn't even know Black people got to Oklahoma. We had known about the migration, or I had known about the migration going north, but the westward migration is so undertold. Also the idea of, Oklahoma before it was a state. And so I also then thought, well, why wouldn't you go to the Pacific, where you have a sense of freedom and openness? Why would you be landlocked? And then how can we not forget the blues songs about the train done gone, or I hear the train coming. So all of those things just fell together. And this is true. I don't really plot my books. That literally, once I get the voice, once I get that first paragraph, it opens up everything else. So I opened up, I'm on the run. I got to get out of here. I maybe need to migrate from this city, leave these people who want to lynch me. And the idea that there's prophecy and there's magic. And then the fact that Tulsa was called the Magic City, woo, that was like school. Yeah. But also one of the things in terms of thinking about the age and reading about the time of the 1920s, the spiritualism movement was a flutter. So Harry Houdini, again, a Jewish man who was also oppressed, who changed his name to Houdini, was famous almost like a Michael Jackson was in his heyday. And he used to have all these bets with Arthur Conan Doyle about whether or not the dead are actually, you can actually bring them back to life, or that you can resurrect them, or at least see their spirits. Now, I had the wisdom of a grandmother who told me, Joel, child, every dead ain't gone. Every goodbye ain't gone. And actually, she was telling me that spirits are with us. And my grandmother's spirit is still with me, though she's been dead for about 30 years. So that then opened up the door to have Harry Houdini as a ghost within the novel. and also to talk about the Jewish attempts to overcome oppression. The Jewish go down Moses, let my people go. And that fit in with how for slaves, singing that spiritual was also uplifting and gave slaves a hope that one day we too shall be freed. One day we shall be overcome. So now we got this whole combination of Jewish resistance, Black resistance, Magic City, prophecy, signs, getting on a train, migration. And it just was like a little garden of ideas that just bloomed. But one of the surprising things that I did not know about was war, and how young men, and it still befuddles me, and now of course it's young men and young women who would go off to war and fight and die and become wounded for our country. And in the 1920s, that slew of wonderful, gorgeous, brilliant Black men, sons, cousins, uncles who went off to war to fight. And American soldiers, white Americans, wouldn't serve with them. So the French said, oh, we'll fight with them. And the French and the Black soldiers did enormously wondrous things. So Klan membership, rioting, lynching, all of that had been on a decline. But the day that the 369th Black Army Infantry marched down Harlem with their guns and showed themselves as the proud men that they were, boom, the riots, the massacres, the lynchings, everything went on an upswing, KKK membership. So having those pieces of the historical time, the social time, with also these characters, it just exploded. It was a journey for me worth taking, and really caused me to plumb my depths of understanding and my own empathy.
What you just said about kind of that overlap of kind of different types of oppression and some of those things. Some people may not know this, but you talked about spirituals and things like that. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was written here in Oklahoma by a Choctaw freedman, and the freedmen played a pretty big role in the early periods of some Greenwood as well. But that was written by a person here. And then of course that song becomes adopted by the abolitionists, of course. But then at some point, I can't remember the date, but it was added to the Nazis list of undesirable songs. So it's like you see these things kind of, so it kind of, all those things kind of end up, it's like the idea of freedom, you can kind of see how it bleeds into all these different areas. But you made me think of that. But most people don't know that hymn was composed here in
I did not know that. I didn't know that. And actually, though I had studied and researched some of the Native history, as my second novel, trying to fit all it in. Sometimes I address novel writing as taking the chaos and trying to wrestle it down. And I could not do as much with the Native storylines as I would have wished. But I did have a Native character, Lena, that I put in terms of that presence of how Tulsa at the time, was anti-Native, anti-Black, anti-Union, anti-Jewish, anti-everything. And I do have that sense that these barriers that separate us, they're so artificial. We are all humans. And it's like, if only we could all speak in one voice and rise up in allyship, things would become better.
Well, I guess that's in some ways the definition of white supremacy is if you're not that, you're something else. And and it turns everything that's not that into the other, right?
Yeah. Yes, the other. And pits the other against the other if they can.
Yeah. One thing I was also thinking about, the more I was thinking about rereading the book for the umpteenth time, was, there are some things here you kind of flip on their head, right? There's this trope that goes back to, gosh, I don't know how old, of the magical Negro, right? The concept of the magical Negro. And that has been kind of reclaimed. There's a wonderful book, actually just came out last year, a book of poems by Morgan Parker called Magical Negro. But it's a term that it existed in literature, and it was the idea that the only person of color with redeemable values basically had to be an angel sent from heaven that could, it couldn't just be a regular person. Yeah. Was that concept, were you aware of that concept and that idea, that trope when you were writing the book?
Not at all.
No.
Not at all. But I was aware, which later on, as I went on to get, my doctorate in English and all that kind of stuff, that there was magic, spiritual magic in my upbringing. I remember the first time I saw the Big and Little Dipper in the sky. My sister and my cousins and I, we thought it was a sign from God. And we ran inside the house and got a Bible and did like this. And I can't remember what we read, but we thought it was just right, and that the grandmother taught me to see the world as filled with all kinds of spiritual mysteries. So as I understand my own craft now, I was actually writing, no, it's not magical as in magical Negro. It's not magical as in magical realism. It just is Black culture, and Black culture can see spirits and can see ghosts. And it's not just actually Black culture. You can talk about Southeast Asian cultures. You can talk about Day of the Dead for Hispanic cultures, and some Native traditions. Right. So to me, it's a kind of reality that Joe can see ghosts and hear ghosts. And that, I think, makes it less of a sensationalist thing, makes it less of a gimmick. It really is, the Black community as I understood it growing up as a child. And I think it's still current, because I still have ghosts in Ghost Boy. It's the ghost of Emmett Till. Why not? I can see the ghost of my grandmother. Actually, that's another story I can tell you about. I know spells to bring back the dead. My grandmother taught me, and I once went to interview Eartha Kitt, and wow. Her grandmother taught her the same spell. Now, I must admit, I've never tried it, but there were times in my family where things happened that we couldn't explain, that my grandmother would pick up a phone and be talking to someone. And then she'd put the phone down, and my grandpa would say, "Ernie, what are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, that was, Aunt so-and-so telling me it was time for me to get ready because she had died." So that's the kind of world that I grew up in. And I could go on and tell you more and more. So for me, it's just real.
Yeah.
Jeff, I shared all that with you, Jeff.
You know what though? I was thinking there's no one I would rather do a seance with than Eartha Kitt. What an amazing experience that would be.
Yes. Oh yes. And we just roared. We just roared, and it was like amazing. Yes. But wow. Eartha Kitt was absolutely fantastic. So she knew what tradition I was talking about. Yes.
Wow. Anyway, that's amazing. I love her. So I'm curious, what was, we know so much more, at least I do, of course, and I think everybody who's spent time reading about this, really, over the last 20 years, the propulsion of knowledge about this topic has really, rightly so, finally caught up with what it should be. But have you learned more about this than you did then? Do you think if you were writing the book now, it would be much different in terms of just base knowledge of what happened during the massacre?
Yes. Absolutely. And I don't know, I think it would be I hope it would be a better book, because you hope you get better with time, But one of the things that I've discovered about my career is that, say, Alexander Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers. Did you know he was a Black man?
Not till much later,
Yes, well,
I had read the book 20 years before I knew that, probably.
Okay, so I discovered that when he was 25, but that now appears as an important component in my book, Black Brother, my book that's out right now. So in general, our Mami Wata, the mother goddess, the mother of water, who I knew about when I was a teenager, started appearing in my books when I was in my 50s. So in some ways, I think there were things that I get caught in and I get a passion for them and they sort of stay inside my soul, and it's waiting for the time for when it would come out. So if I said I'm going to sit down and write Magic City all over again, I would have to still have that spark that I had where I carried that piece of paper for all those years, knowing that I was going to write a story about this, and actually being willing to risk losing a contract over Magic City, because I could have stopped and said, okay, I'll give you a Voodoo Dreams too, but it was like, no, this time for this book is now. So
yeah,
who knows?
Quick commercial for everybody out there watching. Get a copy of this book, not just because you should read it and because it's one of my favorite books of all time, but because this beautiful new edition, and with this afterword that Jewell has written, really contextualizes the book in a way. And I'm so glad it's an afterword and not an introduction, because I think you need to kind of go through that journey and then kind of have that at the end, whereas you would kind of give away too much context. I think a lot of times new editions, they assume everyone's read the book already. And if you read the introduction, it kind of spoils the book a little bit.
Yes,
yes. And so this does not do that, which is nice.
No, I've actually long thought that Magic City was one of the best books I'd ever written. And for a lot of different reasons, it was my lost baby, that it was the book that did not get the attention I think that maybe it should have. Mm-hmm. I, as a writer, spent 3 years writing it, and I laid it all on the line. And when I let it go, all I could say is I did the best that I could do for that point in time. That was it. I didn't hold anything back.
We have a question. We were talking about what's next a little bit before we got on air, and I know you have a new book coming in September. And someone asks, Kristen asks, if the time has to be right for your next book, so what time is it now for your next book? You want to talk about what's coming in September, or maybe what you're working on now?
Okay. Well, in September, and this is the advanced reading copy, Paradise on Fire is coming. And Paradise on Fire is actually based on a real experience. So I use history, research, experiences to generate ideas for my books. And I was once in Wyoming, and there was a row of Black kids. And I've been to Wyoming, well, actually several times. And I generally don't meet a row of Black kids. It turns out that they were city kids from Washington, D.C., and in a program called City Kids. And they go to Wyoming every year to learn skills and how to sort of be one with nature and hike and canoeing. Now, most urban kids, particularly of color, don't learn that. I never learned how to swim. I didn't know what hiking was. It's like camping. Are you kidding? I'll take the Ritz-Carlton. And yet there's a whole big world out there that I think all of our kids need to know and experience. So it's about a girl named Addie Adago, which means a Nigerian daughter of eagles. And she has a sense of aerial perception, and she's great at cartography and map making. And she goes west to California and actually finds out, hey, she's pretty good at this stuff, She's really a trooper. And when the wildfires begin, she is the one that's responsible leading her friends to safety. She has her own spiritual connection to fire and why it's damaging and traumatic for her on a personal level. She's got street smarts as well as that spiritual sense and connection that, no, I see the landscape. And she decides in the future, I think, that she'll be an environmental engineer. Did you know that the National Park Services, that the people who go there to the national parks are 95% white? And actually, there's a new movement for diversity, because if you have less than 5% of your sort of attendees being people of color, then how can we ensure that people are connected to the earth and caring for the planet? So this is about a brave girl who works on the problem of climate change.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I did go camping as a kid, and I still think I would take the Ritz-Carlton over camping. That's just me.
I totally understand. But on the other hand, I'm a fan of the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts. And my daughter was a Girl Scout, and she has confidence in nature that I had never had. She does, caving and canoeing and hiking in Colorado. And I remember one day there was the idea that there was a tornado coming, you know, or some natural disaster. And she said, you know, I'll just slap my baby on my back and we will walk out of there. And that sense of confidence and
agency.
survival. Yeah, and yes, agency. It was like, wow, I'm so proud. I'm so proud of her. So I think there are things to learn. And also now I'm in Seattle, in case you guys don't know. And I came to Seattle on my very first book for book tour and discovered that my landscape is Seattle. I've been all over the world, all different kinds of places. But the Pacific Northwest and Wales is where my heart sings.
That's a good choice. You know, ironically, it rained all damn day here. It probably didn't rain there today. So I'm curious to know, as we wrap up, we've got a few minutes left here. After Voodoo Dreams and after Magic City, of course, you have really kind of owned this space that you have been pursuing for the last couple of decades in this area where writing these amazing books for young readers. We mentioned Ghost Boys, of course, Black Brother. You just mentioned the new book. How did that happen? Was that a choice, or did you kind of just slide into that space?
Well, because reading and literacy was so important for me as a kid, when I found out that I could be a writer, I always wanted to write for youth. I think in some ways I wanted to write for youth the books that I could have used, the books that I never had. So in truth, I spent 30 years writing for adults, trying to become good enough to write for kids. And I'd always bug my agent and say, I'm going to write a kid's book. And he'd say, Jewell, whenever you're ready. And it took me a while. And it wasn't until the day that Hurricane Katrina hit, which was about 12 or so years ago, that I was publishing a novel about New Orleans. And I was feeling bittersweet because I was glad to have another book out, but I did not want that city to suffer. I love New Orleans. And crazily enough, my book publisher sent me to New Orleans 2 weeks after Hurricane Katrina. And that town was devastated, that community distraught. And immediately I knew this would be my children's book, because I thought, what about the children who have to survive and be resilient? What about the animals? And so I started, better late than never, my dream career of writing books for youth and encouraging for other youth to know that they matter. So whether you're a biracial kid in Black Brother, or in our society, you matter, you are important, or you're a Black kid, you are important, whether you're the Hispanic a supporting character, he is important in his tradition of Day of the Dead and how that interweaves with Emmett Till and the Lost Boys who have been murdered because of police violence. All of that matters. So actually I try to keep as much as possible, and that dates from Magic City and Voodoo Dreams, the sense of a multi-ethnic world. Joe's story is important, but Mary, the white woman, when they said, did he assault you? She, at least from what I knew during my research at the time, said, no, nothing happened. And she didn't allow them to use her white female body as an excuse to lynch and murder a Black man. Contrast that with later, even in the 1950s, 2 white men are set free for brutalizing and killing Emmett Till. So I also wanted to give a shout out to this woman. And because there was one, it makes me think, well, there must have been more and we don't hear about it. Women who said no, as white women, no, I'm not going to let you use me as a prop for violence. So I knew starting out that I wanted to have Joe and Mary, Joseph and Mary, yeah. Joe and Mary, and have their voices as well as Alan's as the Jewish. And so in some sense, I'm writing in the same way, but for different age groups, trying to tell stories of the African-American heritage, trying to add other narratives that should be understood and appreciated, trying to sort of highlight the Black experience, but also that experience in the context of a multi-ethnic world where we all need to say, this is not right when it's not right, and be allies, and then be loving and supportive of one another when we're trying to make a better planet for all of us to live and strive and be better.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly what, this book did for me. I think about this a lot. I've been thinking about it more as I was preparing for this conversation with you and thinking about what this book meant to me. And, of course, I read it as a young person. I was a teenager when I first read it. And, it's not a book, targeted at kids, but the books you read when you're that age, I think in some ways stick with you at longer than other books. And you're at such a formative period. But, growing up in Tulsa, especially even into the 80s and 90s, it was still, and unfortunately still to this day, is quite segregated. You could easily go a full day with hardly interacting with someone from another race, which is sad but true. And I don't think that's totally unique to Tulsa still. I think it's a big problem in a lot of American cities still. But popular culture and books and movies and things like that were places where I could be exposed to other cultures and other ways of living. And it's not the ideal situation. The ideal situation is more pluralistic society where you're interacting in school and, at that level.
Absolutely.
But having books by people like you and other things kind of opened me up in a way.
The world, yes.
No,
and I also agree with you on the hyper segregation, that there are a lot of places in the US where, you could live and breathe and die, and you don't really interact with anybody of another racial group or another status in terms of class. Actually, Tulsa gave me one memory that I have never gotten anywhere else. The only time that I've seen the Ku Klux Klan in person was, in fact, in Tulsa. I was coming to Tulsa every year for the Tulsa conference at Oklahoma State, I think. And my daughter was with me, and we were all eager to have Cecily Tyson speak. And we were driving by the courthouse, and the Klan were robed, and they were protesting. And I was like shocked, because to see it was really just startling. And then there was that flip side of that there were male and female police officers of all races who are protecting their right to assembly. So I've always had this sense of duality from that moment of me in Tulsa. And I've been to Tulsa over the last few years and seeing how Tulsa's growing. So even though I know that there are still problems and there's still segregation, the new attention given to Deep Greenwood, the new attention given to diverse voices and allyship, it makes me think that there still might be people there who don't want to know the truth about history, but there are other people like you, the artist, the bookseller, the police officer doesn't have implicit bias, that is there for all voices to be heard. And maybe this time around we'll make sure that there's a symphony of voices. And from that, at least there's the hope that those who want to ignore racism, ignore white supremacy, will one day be more attuned to it.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to kind of know about that, you think about the fact that David Duke and Cornel West were both born in Tulsa, I think in the same year. Maybe at least, or maybe 1 year apart, but very close, and you think about the dichotomy of a city. I always think of that as a really interesting moment. But we have one more question before we wrap up. And it's, the HBO show Watchmen was set in Tulsa around this issue. There are about 5 documentaries coming out about this. We have one more question, which is, have you had any renewed or ever had interest in making an adaptation of Magic City for television or a movie?
When it first came out, there were several people who were interested in making it into a movie. One group I know didn't get the money to do it. And another group, when Rosewood came out by John Singleton, that's sort of like, we have a race riot that was a massacre movie already. We don't need another one.
Right.
And so everything stopped. And actually, I think my story of Tulsa and Deep Greenwood is far more interesting than the Rosewood story. It's more inclusive of the human heart and the systems of oppression that were at work during the time. This time, so far, no movie interest. We did. They are shopping it. And I still think, as I do with fiction, there's a certain power in fiction that nonfiction, doesn't have. It's a different kind of power. So too, I think having a film adaptation would be a different kind of power than a book. And though I liked The Watchmen very much, and I've not liked, but the opening scenes I think were very, very powerful. I still think that there's room for people to really see in color on the big screen and to follow the lives of all these wondrous people that were hurt, harmed, or that were simply, killed. I think that there would be a powerful story that we would be ready for now. So maybe somebody will tell it. Yeah. Sometimes I think with nonfiction or documentary, we tend to feel like, oh, that's still the past. And I believe the past is very present, that the past is personal. History is now. And so I still think our culture needs the film of Deep Greenwood to really have that hit home. So just like the film of the Capitol rioters, sort of like, oh, you know what you're seeing, and it brings it home in a different kind of way. So too, with the death and murder of George Floyd, we know and we see, and we will not unsee that. There is a power of film that I want people to see what happened to Deep Greenwood, to this prosperous community that can't be unseen. I want them to see and not ever forget. And in the meantime, I feel it in my book.
Yeah, and it's so true. It's so true, and it's like, that's why, if you watch like Ryan Coogler's Fruitvale Station film, it's so different than watching like a police recorded video, because you're connecting to the people in a different way, because it doesn't create the separation in a way. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I just want to tell you, thank you so much for writing this book. It obviously has impacted my life. And I think, anytime you visit on the corner of Archer in Detroit, there's a store that's a tribute to you and this book. And I hope that you know that, and that it wouldn't be called that. And it certainly in some ways wouldn't exist without this book and what you did.
Oh my God, I am so touched by that. And I thank you so very, very much. Gosh, I'm just blown away.
Yeah. Well, I was blown away by the book. So.
Well, I keep doing what I'm doing, and I'll probably write some other adult stories and my youth stories. But I've stayed true to the idea that I want to promote equity and social justice for everybody. And so the stories that grip my heart that need to be told are the ones that shed a light on the need for all of that. So Magic City was special and momentous for me in writing that story, and cemented what I would go on to do with the rest of my career.
Well, it means a lot to us. I want to say thank you for doing this. I hope everyone watching gets a copy of Magic City or gives it to someone. This is a great book to give to someone in your life and talk about. And hopefully next time, Jewell, we'll do this in person, maybe, right?
Are you kidding me? That I tell you, as soon as we're out of the pandemic, you set a date, and I'll come. I'll come just for you, and I'm gonna maybe bring my husband and my kids.
Please.
Because right now I'm gonna run away from this computer and go tell them, you won't believe what I just did. Jeff. I mean, that is the most heartwarming, wondrous story I ever heard. So thank you. That'll carry me all the way to the grave. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.